Professor Erik Herron is an associate professor of political science in 2004 to 2007, actually 8 officially. Professor Herron served as director of CREES. His teaching and research interests include comparative politics and elections in post-communist societies. His teaching has been innovative, particularly for its distance learning aspect. He managed a virtual classroom program grant from the U.S. State Department to develop an interactive course with universities in Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, and Mongolia. Professor Herron has 2 books that deal with election processes in the post-communist world. Currently, he's collaborating on an NSF project addressing personnel decision-making in political parties with a focus on Lithuania and Ukraine. He works in both Russian and Ukrainian languages. Professor Herron has stood as election observer for OSCE elections in Russia, Georgia, and Ukraine, and for national elections in Ukraine and Azerbaijan. He assisted the Open Society Institute in its recruitment and training of scholars from the South Caucasus and Central Asia. Please help me welcome Herron.
Several years ago, a graduate student attended his first conference to make his first presentation. It was a prominent area studies conference. And as conferences go, he made his presentation, about 15 minutes, and he waited for the comments of the discussant, who would review his paper and relate it to the discipline, relate it to the field. After everyone gave their presentations, the discussant calmly began. Erik's paper makes no contribution whatsoever to the literature. Now that was a tough opening phrase, especially for a graduate student making his first presentation to a full room of scholars in the field. But she continued, because his paper is cross-national and uses quantitative data. So this introductory line was followed by a polemic against a particular brand of scholarship. Now, frankly, my paper wasn't very good, and could have been criticized on its own merits or lack of merits. But the discussant used it as a vehicle to air her grievances against developments in the social sciences, and in political science in particular. And this experience was my first real exposure to the intensity of the debate over how social scientists, and especially political scientists, should study the emerging post-communist region. Her expression was perhaps an extreme view, but it was one that was held and is held by some social scientists. We can think of area studies in various ways. Some scholars view it as an intensive study of a region or a society with no real intent to generalize those findings beyond that specific object of study. Other scholars view area studies as an important component in the development of ideas that can be applied across societies or across different regions of the world. Understanding one case well provides necessary context for understanding other cases. As the political scientist Giovanni Sartori once put it, he or she who knows one country knows none, or only one country knows none. And area studies has a third meaning, and something that we're really celebrating here. It's an organizational concept. It's programs like ours, celebrating 50 or 51, depending on how we count it, years, and bringing together scholars who study a particular region. In my remarks today, and the remainder of my remarks, what I want to do is talk a little bit about area studies now and in the future from the perspective of a political scientist. I'll comment briefly on the challenges for the center, the opportunities that the center has as we look toward the future, and as the connections between the countries in our region become more distant, more tenuous. The bottom line is that area studies has been a flexible enterprise in the past, drawing upon the contributions or drawing upon and contributing to various fields of inquiry. And I think continued flexibility will allow area studies to remain relevant in social science and in all disciplines. Now, the criticism of my paper was part of a broader movement, especially in the 1990s. It began in the 1990s. It accelerated in the 1990s across social science, but it was especially intense in political science. It reached a fever pitch at the end of the 1990s with the publication and release of the so-called Perestroika Manifesto. An unnamed individual whose identity remains not officially released, at least until this day, emailed an incendiary and I would say not well thought through document commenting on the state of political science, especially its leading journal, the American Political Science Review. I happened to work for the American Political Science Review at the time as a graduate student, so this manifesto became a subject of much discussion among the graduate students and the faculty at my university. And one of the manifesto's points turned directly to our area of the world, the area of the world that we study. And I quote from the manifesto. Have we learned any lesson from the thousands of pages of research that was funded by APSA, the American Political Science Association, in the name of political science to examine the former Soviet Union and make predictive models? What happened to those models and why did they fail? How is it that those esteemed colleagues failed to predict the collapse of the Soviet Union, while Sovietologists from Korea, Japan, India, and one even from Tanzania could predict the fall of empire? Are we making the same mistake by ignoring diverse knowledges and methodologies present in the study of politics? I am not familiar with the Sovietologists from Korea, Japan, India, and from Tanzania who predicted the fall of the Soviet Union, but as Richard mentioned, it was widely considered to be a surprise. One of the great ironies of this manifesto was that it implicitly and explicitly called for greater attention to area knowledge. At the same time, the author chose the pseudonym Mr. Perestroika. Not only was Perestroika misspelled twice, but the author didn't understand that Perestroika, as a series of policies or a movement, failed. At least it failed in resuscitating the Soviet Union, the economic and political conditions in the Soviet Union. Maybe that's precisely what Mr. Perestroika had in mind, but I have my doubts. Now, despite its dubious origins, the Perestroika movement raised many important questions in political science about the nature of comparative politics, the role of area studies, how departments would make hiring decisions, how departments would train graduate students, how departments would make tenure decisions, and so on. What's emerged over a decade or so after the publication of this manifesto has been a tendency to promote what's called a mixed methods approach. And I think this is a positive contribution of this movement to raise the discourse and discussion and move comparative politics in particular in this direction. And in the mixed methods approach, area knowledge, deep understanding of a region's society's language, historical or cultural traditions, as well as its politics, is a core component of research. But area studies is not an end. Rather, it's a component of studies with broader implications that can cut across traditional regional boundaries. It's accompanied by additional training in quantitative and qualitative methodologies and research design that seeks to place findings from one region in a broader context. And recently, I was directly confronted with some of the challenges of the rise of the mixed methods approach. So as I was finalizing these remarks over the last couple of weeks, I received notification that I had a manuscript that I had submitted accepted for revise and resubmit status. Now, all the faculty here know what that means. For those of you who are visitors or students who haven't been through the peer review process, just let me explain it for a moment. You write a paper, present it at conferences, send it to a journal. It is sent out anonymously to peers in the field who know the subject matter, they evaluate it, and make recommendations to the editor. And depending on the journal, the editor will make decisions based solely sometimes on these reviews. Sometimes the editor will be more active in making decisions about whether the paper should be rejected, invited for revisions, or accepted. And I got a letter inviting revisions, so hopefully that will all work out, and I'm quite done with it, and you'll see why in a moment. So the paper addressed 2 elections in Azerbaijan. And the letter from the editor asked me to do the following. First, the editor said, the paper is not framed in a broadly comparative manner. So you need to frame it in a broadly comparative manner, which is something I can do. I can do. And I'm working on it. So I think, good. Step 1, I can do. Be attentive, the editor said, to reviewer 4, especially these comments. Comments of reviewer 4 asked me to increase my commentary on local politics and the context within Azerbaijan. Okay, I can do that as well. And by the way, the editor said, it's running a bit long. So, I'm faced with the task of contextualizing it in a broadly comparative framework, providing more local coverage, and so that's what I'm doing. But that's the challenge that many scholars in comparative politics face now. Through the rise of this mixed methods approach. This mixed methods approach is really becoming the coin of the realm in comparative politics, and it does carry implications for area study centers. Students and scholars, especially in comparative politics and political science, but likely across other social science disciplines, will certainly value the knowledge and skills that they can gain from area study centers, but they're not solely interested in being area specialists. And in fact, as the example from this particular journal illustrates, being an area specialist and not being able to more broadly contextualize the research would result in rejection from that journal and rejection from publication. So in the 2 decades or so since the collapse of communism, our collective of scholars here at the center and elsewhere, those of us who study the region, are threatened with becoming a grand falloon. Those of you who are familiar with Kurt Vonnegut will recognize that term. It characterizes a group that claims a shared purpose or a common identity, but lacks genuine connections. Alternatively put, and you can see this summary or quotation about Vonnegut's term in many different places. And I quote, "A grand falloon is a proud and meaningless association of human beings." And when the center began 51 years ago, our region had a unifying theme. Political, economic, social, historical events converged to create a region that seemed to have a lot in common. Scholars and observers recognized that there was variation across the region, but it was still an area worthy of study. Now, our area has little in terms of a contemporary unifying theme. Politically, the states that emerged from communism are about as diverse as one could imagine. Some are reasonably successful parliamentary democracies that have joined the European Union. Others are autocracies, different kinds of authoritarian systems, but autocracies. And some are caught in the middle with features of pluralistic politics and features of dictatorship coexisting. We also know that the center's inception, or very soon after, our research, or rather our region, was the primary focus of policymakers, of media, and eventually of students. The Cold War focused resources and attention on our region. Now it's of less importance in terms of national security and economic development. Now, while it doesn't counteract some of these trends that challenge the nature of Russian and East European and Eurasian studies, the growing preference for mixed methods and the mixed methods approach generates demand for deep knowledge. But the depth that students and scholars might seek now could be less intense than in the past. Students might seem a bit mercenary in what they seek. Language study is more likely to be viewed as a research tool rather than as a gateway to cultural understanding. The first approach that I outlined to area studies at the beginning of the remarks, the approach that emphasized depth and did not seek generalization. This approach is waning in the departments that teach political science and, again, in many other social science disciplines and in the training of graduate students. Now, rather than lament or fight its decline, I think that we can take advantage of what has replaced it. New social science scholars are not separated into those who know region or compare across regions. They have to do both. And I think my own research has benefited from this combination. My bachelor's degree and master's degree are in Russian and East European area studies. My PhD is in political science and focused on these more broadly comparative approaches. And over the years, I've come upon research projects that require me to use skills from both areas to be effective. And, one example comes from some of the experiences I had that Edith mentioned as an observer of elections in many post-communist states. I've treated those election missions as an opportunity to conduct research as a participant observer. My area background, especially my language skills, served as a crucial element in obtaining invitations to serve as an observer. While in polling stations, I found that my cultural background, my understanding of language, helped me gather information or intel for some of you here. In some cases, local officials and citizens didn't realize or forgot that I understood Russian. In one instance, when I was observing the overnight vote count in Russia, the local commission was unable to make the numbers balance. To turn in the election results, the numbers have to balance. The number of ballots you receive, the number of people who voted, the number of ballots that are invalidated, the total count for all candidates, parties, it all has to work out or you cannot turn in the results. And they couldn't make the numbers balance. And unfortunately for them, there were two observers from an international organization there, complicating the process. So in the wee hours of the morning, 3, 4 a.m., one of the political party observers, political parties were allowed to have their own observers in the polling stations as well, made recommendations to the committee about how to solve the problem. The committee could just take away votes from one of his opponents, everything would balance, and all would be well. Now, this was uttered in a semi-whisper, but my observation partner and I could clearly hear it. The Election Commission recognized that we could clearly hear it. And let's just say the night went on for a very, very long time. But area studies helped me gain access to understand, interpret elements of the election process. But my background in quantitative analysis helped me better assess the evidence. So using various tools, I've had conversations with Edith's husband Craig from the mathematics department about principles in mathematics that you can apply to understand natural and anomalous production of data. Tools in statistics and econometrics all have combined together in assessments I've made of data at the polling station level to see where there are anomalous results that are potentially attributable to fraud. And I've situated versions of this research both in the area studies literature and also in the growing literature on election quality that's more broadly comparative, that covers countries all over the world, including the United States. The work is also been used by practitioners. There's a local organization in Ukraine which has used some of the findings from these papers to make plans on how it's going to deploy election observers. And I think the synthesis of area studies and comparative approaches, qualitative and quantitative methods, academic and practical targets for research is not unique to the study of election quality, but it does represent a way that the orientation to area studies has changed. Area studies has an important role to play in all disciplines, especially in political science. It's always been flexible, drawing upon and contributing to every discipline represented here. And I think that the current era and probable future of area studies reflects this tradition. And with that, I'm going to conclude my remarks. So thank you.